Episode 5 Something to Sink Your Teeth Into. It's a cold night in 1954, and as you leave the warmth of your police car behind, you put on your hat and walk tentatively towards the fog-shrouded entrance to the vast Victorian cemetery. The large iron gates have been prized open, and you just manage to slip through them and away from the safety of the streetlights outside. Once inside, you let your eyes adjust to the gloom, knowing if you use your torch too soon, everything outside of its narrow beam will appear black. Eventually, having gained a sense of the path you're standing on, you switch on your flashlight and scan it from side to side. As the beam slices through the fog, it reveals countless oversized tombs and rectangular stone memorials, which make the place appear like some mythical labyrinth. This cemetery, which is home to 250,000 guests, is called the Necropolis, City of the Dead. Suddenly, something races past you in the darkness. You spin quickly round, pointing your fading torch into the shadows between the gravestones, but you're too late. You see a shape scuttling away, and then the maddening sound of whispering voices drift from over your shoulder. You turn sharply and peer again into the darkness, but see nothing other than the angular silhouettes of tall Celtic crosses and carved stone figures. And then a loud scream cuts through the silence. It seems to have come from the far side of the graveyard. You run towards it, your torchlight casting fleeting illumination on the carved angels and the memorials around you. Eventually, you stop, breathing hard, and find yourself in a circular area at the heart of the necropolis. By now, the whispers have grown louder, coming seemingly from every direction. You can feel your heart thumping in your chest, your blood pulsing through your veins. There are things out there in the darkness, watching you, waiting. "Show yourself," you call out, and then add weakly, "in the name of the law." They step cautiously out of the shadows. At first, just one small pale figure, then another and another, until you find yourself ringed by more than 24 children of various ages. Some are carrying long kitchen knives, others hold pointed tools, and many carry sharpened pieces of wood and hammers. "What in God's name are you doing?" you cry out. For a while, none of the children speak, and finally, a tall, dark-haired boy steps forward, his stake held before him like a sword. He says 4 words that you will never forget. "We're hunting the vampire." I'm Norman Brown, and you're listening to the Scary Scotland podcast, where we delve into the darker corners of Scottish legends to make connections with the wider world and culture. Tonight, in episode 5, Something to Sink Your Teeth Into, we will explore the idea of Scottish vampires and consider some notable examples, including the Gorbals Vampire and Lord Ruthven, and an outbreak in Berwick, to discover the enduring allure of these stories. And finally, we'll reflect on why Scotland provides such a fitting backdrop for tales of the undead. So make yourself comfortable and come with me as we investigate the vampires of Scotland. My homeland is famed for being a place of misty glens, shadowy forests and rugged landscapes. As we know, this backdrop has served as fertile ground for tales of the supernatural. When you consider how many ancient castles, Gothic graveyards, and misty mountains paper the landscape, it's hardly surprising that stories of vampires, beings that straddle the line between myth and nightmare, are also firmly woven into our history and culture. One of the most infamous examples of vampire lore found in Scotland is the fascinating tale of the Gorbals Vampire, which we got a taste of in the opening of the show. This particular legend emerged not from centuries-old folklore, but from the mid-20th century in the industrial heart of the south side of Glasgow. In 1954, Reports began to circulate among local children that a vampire was prowling the southern necropolis, a massive Victorian cemetery in the Gorbals district. This was an industrial landscape, defined by the overcrowded tenement housing, heavy industry, and the hardships that came with this. Although Glasgow was about to embark on a regeneration that would see it rise like a phoenix from the soot, smoke and ashes of the Industrial Revolution, it had not started yet. So life in the Gorbals was hard, and for children living there, entertainment was thin on the ground. So when a rumour about a monstrous creature flickered to life and was passed from person to person, the story spread like wildfire. It was whispered in damp homes, in school playgrounds, and in the cold, dark streets. According to the rumours, this creature was gleefully described as being 7 feet tall, with iron teeth, and to add to the horror, it was responsible for the disappearance of several local children, 2 of whom had been murdered. What followed was a remarkable scene. Dozens of children armed themselves with sticks, knives, and stakes, and then descended like a small army upon the cemetery, determined to hunt the foul creature. It, if you'll pardon the pun, sounds like something straight out of a Stephen King novel. Children are being murdered by some supernatural creature. The adults don't seem to care, and so a group of neglected children bravely agree to take matters into their own small hands and set off to destroy the monster. Such was the level of disorder which persisted for 3 nights that the police were called to the scene, and even they struggled to finally deflect the hunters from their grim mission. The event caused a media frenzy and alarmed local authorities, who dismissed the claims as hysteria. But desperate to find a convenient explanation, the authorities decided, without any particular evidence, that the whole event had been triggered by a new form of entertainment which was enjoying increasing popularity in the west coast of Scotland: American horror comics. As bizarre as it might seem, the societal concerns about horror comics grew itself into feverish anxieties, which led to intense debate in the House of Commons. Much like the plot of a vampire novel, the narrative suggested that this dark, seductive form had slipped unseen into the city via ships crossing the North Atlantic. The material had soon spread, entrancing and corrupting the young, until it grew to threaten our very existence. As a direct result of the events in the necropolis involving the aspiring small Van Helsings, the Harmful Publications Act of 1954, to shield young people from the moral and psychological damage of reading scary stories. It's worth noting that many of the accusations directed at these fun publications came from the owners of conventional British newspapers, which had been the dominant form of print media for almost a century. As a result of its impact on the wider nation, the Gorbals Vampire became more than just a bizarre episode of mass panic. It has since been studied as a cultural phenomenon, shedding light on the power of urban legends and how they adapt to their specific environment. Much like a vampire, these stories infiltrate a community and are difficult to eradicate, and so live on far beyond the inhabitants of the area which spawned it. In a post-war Scotland, marked by poverty and social upheaval, the vampire embodied the fears and anxieties of the community. Its legend persists as a symbol of Glasgow's unique urban folklore and the deeper fears of a seemingly civilised society. But stories of Scottish vampires predate the arrival of salacious horror comics in the 1950s. Long before the Industrial Age, tales of vampiric beings haunted the Scottish Highlands. Chief amongst these is the Baobhan Sith, a creature deeply embedded in Celtic folklore. The term Sith means fairy in Scots, and the word Baobhan means witch. So much like the Nuclevi we encountered at the end of episode 4, this creature is part of the dark fairy realm. Her behaviour seems to match many of the tropes of the trickster-type creatures which feature prominently in many other cultures' myths. Often described as a beautiful woman dressed in green, the Baobhan Sith lures unsuspecting men to their doom. Unlike the classic European vampire, she does not have fangs. Instead, she drains her victim's blood through scratches made by her long nails. The Baobhan Sith's MO typically involves seduction. In many stories, she appears to hunters or travellers who are isolated in the Scottish wilderness. After enchanting them with her beauty and dance, she reveals her true nature and attacks. In some versions of the myth, her victims are spared if they manage to survive until dawn or escape her presence entirely. The legend reflects the Highlands' harsh and isolating environment where danger lurks not only in the landscape, but also in the unseen forces of the supernatural. The Baobhan is a stark warning against the perils of temptation and the unpredictability of nature. But it's difficult to read accounts of the Baobhan without thinking of similar stories, such as that of the Japanese Yamamba, the cannibal witch who invites isolated travellers into her mountain home before assuming her true form. Or the Romanian beldam, a fairy defender of the forest who grew to hate humans for their destruction of her woodlands. According to legend, the beldam had a daughter, Fata Paduri. She assumes the appearance of a beautiful female to lure youthful travellers into the forest, where she slaughters them and eats their hearts. And here we find a detail which will later infect almost all vampire stories. Consuming the flesh and blood of the young is what keeps this creature youthful forever. So in the seductive and deadly Baobhan we can see connections not only to other Scottish mythology, but also to wider myths which served as the origin of the fictional vampire. And that is not the only connection between Scotland and the vampire in literature. In the realm of Gothic literature, Scotland's contribution to vampire lore includes Lord Ruthven, one of the earliest examples of the aristocratic vampire archetype. Created by John William Polidori, Lord Ruthven made his debut in the 1819 short story The Vampire. While Polidori was English, Ruthven's character was inspired by a Scottish nobleman and bears a name that ties him to Scotland. Ruthven is presented as a suave, predatory figure who preys on the young and innocent. In many ways, despite being written more than 200 years ago, Ruthven seems to represent the kind of predatory males that we would very much recognise in our own modern society. And perhaps this is why the characters endure, because they reflect genuine dangers and anxieties. In terms of literary significance, Polidori's character laid the groundwork for later cultured vampire legends, including Bram Stoker's Dracula, Anne Rice's Lestat, and Stephen King's Kurt Barlow. Ruthven's connection to Scotland is evident in his name, which may have been inspired by the Ruthven family, a noble clan with a tumultuous history, including accusations of conspiracy and treason. Of course, much of this echoes another literary figure, Shakespeare's Macbeth, who was deeply tied to the supernatural and the spilling of hot blood in a desperate and doomed attempt to achieve power and immortality. Yet Lord Ruthven is still a significant work in its own right for its representation of the eponymous nobleman. The literary Ruthven represents the cultural shift from rural, folkloric vampires to the sophisticated urban vampires of Gothic fiction. His aristocratic demeanour mirrors the hierarchical tensions of the time, and his manipulative charm adds a psychological dimension to the vampire mythos, which in some way might remind us of the trickster aspect of older fairy and demon legends, where people and things are not as they initially appear. But Scotland's relationship with vampires is not limited to the hysteria in the Gorbals or literary creations. Some of our vampires were supposedly quite real. There are numerous accounts of vampires in Scotland which have found their place in historical records. One notable example is to be found in the border town of Berwick upon Tweed. During the medieval period, Berwick was a site of frequent conflict between Scotland and England. Its turbulent history has fostered a variety of ghostly and supernatural tales, including those of vampires. And one such case involves an account of a revenant, a reanimated corpse, that terrorised the entire town. Local folklore describes a man who, after dying, was seen by multiple witnesses wandering the street at night, attacking livestock and spreading disease. The townsfolk, eventually driven mad by fear, exhumed his body and took measures to ensure he would not rise again, including staking and burning the corpse. Unsurprisingly, after this textbook response from the posse of vampire slayers, the revenant did not return again to plague the town. Whilst the historical accuracy of this account is debatable, it clearly illustrates how fears of the supernatural were often tied to real-world concerns, such as plagues and unexplained deaths. It also suggests that it's not just the fear, but also the response to it which echoes down through the centuries. After all, both of them would be seen 400 years later in the necropolis in the Gorbals. Therefore, the Berwick vampire is both a chilling example of how vampire legends were used to explain and help us cope with societal problems, but it's also an indication of how an unknown threat can trigger the most base and instinctive response that we have to defend our community. But of course, every culture has created stories and myths to make sense of the world around them, which begs the question, if such tales and legends are common, why do the vampire stories seem to stand the test of time more than others, adapting and blending into the world of each new successive generation? The enduring nature of vampire myths can perhaps be attributed to a combination of cultural, psychological, and environmental factors. In Scotland, these legends are particularly potent due to the country's unique history and landscape. They are woven into the tales of places and times that are steeped in their own dark and blood-soaked history. It is perhaps easier to believe that a vampire might exist in a place that is already scarred by barbaric witch trials or blighted by disease like the plague, or in the case of the Gorbals, tuberculosis, and the death which follows such things. But in addition to these geographical connections, their vampire myths also have cultural roots. Anyone who explores accounts of our blood-sucking friends will discover that vampire stories often serve as metaphors for societal fears. In the case of the Gorbals Vampire, the legend reflected post-war anxieties and the influence of emerging new media. Similarly, the Baobhan Sith embodies warnings against straying from society's norms or venturing into the unknown. Even in fiction, it's not difficult to see Bram Stoker's iconic Count Dracula as the embodiment of numerous Victorian anxieties about sex and all its consequences, growing levels of immigration, as well as the age-old tension between science and superstition. It also provides the reader with a literal and figurative demonization of the other. Count Dracula is suave, cultured, and deliciously different to all the other male characters in the novel. Similarly, the Baobhan Sith, with her long dark hair, her beautiful eyes, and soft lead lips, would be difficult to resist on a dark and lonely road. But the message of the vampire tale is clear. To be seduced by a vampire is to be destroyed by them. Of course, beyond any local cultural significance of vampires, there's also a deeper psychological appeal too. Yes, vampires tap into universal human fears of disease, death, and predation, but they also promise immortality, liberation from societal constraints, and forbidden pleasures. These themes resonate across cultures and eras, ensuring the vampire's place in storytelling. Vampires are seductive, wise, stylish, and powerful. As a child of the 80s, two of my favourite movies were Highlander and The Lost Boys, both of which explored the transcendent power that comes with immortality, but also the pain and loneliness that such an existence brings. In both movies, the immortals existed alongside humans, but were very much different to us, and infinitely cooler. In The Lost Boys especially, becoming a vampire was represented as being invited into an exclusive club. The vampires were a confident and good-looking tribe. When membership of the vampire gang is offered to the protagonist Michael Emerson by David, the charismatic leader of the vampire gang, his sales pitch sounds difficult to resist. "Join us," he says. "You'll never grow old, Michael, and you'll never die, but you must feed." Thankfully, none of the Scottish vampires that we have looked at were concerned with creating new vampires, or the country might be overrun with them. The nature of Scotland makes it a natural home for vampire legends. The rugged beauty of the Highlands, with its dense forests and remote glens, evokes a sense of mystery and danger. The country's history, marked by clan feuds, battles, and social upheaval, provides fertile ground for stories of vengeance and the supernatural. Additionally, Scotland's rich folklore tradition, populated by fairies, witches, and otherworldly beings, easily accommodates a vampire myth within it. These creatures, whether folkloric, like the Baobhan Sith, or literary, like Lord Ruthven, reflect Scotland's ability to adapt and reinterpret myths to suit ever-changing times and contexts. Ultimately, Scottish vampire legends are more than just tales of the undead. They are mirrors of the human condition, shaped by the cultural and physical landscape of Scotland, From eerie cemeteries of Glasgow to the haunted glens of the Highlands, Scotland remains a land where the line between the real and the supernatural is tantalisingly thin. But before you go, I want to strike a note of caution. Many people who choose to visit Scotland spend at least a little time in the nation's capital, Edinburgh. And it was here, in the year 1900, that local man Geoffrey Anderson, whilst making his way home from work through the centre of town on a dark October evening, encountered something truly terrifying. At that time of day, when the sun had slipped away, the shops had already mostly closed, and few people would be hanging around. The weather would have been bitterly cold, and most people would wrap themselves up and then hurry home to the comfort and heat of the fireside. Such was the case with Mr. Anderson, who was hurrying along the street, until his attention was drawn to movement in one of the wide-mouthed drains which occasionally edged the street. Between Princes Street and Hanover Street, a horse and cart were sitting in the road just outside a small shop, illuminated by the glow from the shop's window. Geoffrey Anderson stopped and stared, first in confusion, then in horror, as he watched some large, pale creature pull itself out of the drain. He said it had upper limbs, but that he could not discern any legs. The creature thankfully did not see him, and instead it moved swiftly to the stationary horse, slid its arms around its neck, and then began to feed. Anderson remained motionless, paralysed with fear, until a laughing couple exited a nearby building and startled the guzzling creature. It quickly detached itself from the indifferent animal, moved swiftly to the drain from whence it came, then slid back into the bowels of the city. Mr. Anderson hurried to the horse and found that other than a small wound on its neck, the horse was unharmed and strangely calm. Perhaps, like bats and leeches, whatever had bitten the horse had some sort of local anaesthetic in its saliva. The incident was recorded in the local newspaper, the Edinburgh Evening News at the time, but it was soon forgotten. Then, over the next few decades, the city changed, war broke out, and life in Edinburgh and the world moved on, at least above ground. Because if the grotesque thing that Mr. Anderson witnessed feeding on a horse before slipping back into the tunnels beneath the city was indeed a vampire, it would be quite possible that it has remained down there for a long time. And if it's able to feed, especially without killing and therefore drawing attention to itself, it may be there still, undiscovered, occasionally slipping out of the darkness to consume the blood of something or someone. And should it be lucky enough to encounter some lost tourist stopping in the shadows to check a map on their phone, or to cut through some dark cobbled lane to reach a coffee shop, they might provide the creature with something to sink its teeth into. I'm Norman Brown. Thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and rate the show on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, or whichever platform you prefer. A new episode will drop every fortnight or sooner, so there will be many scary stories to explore. Tonight's episode, Something to Sink Your Teeth Into, includes facts from davidcastleton.net, folklorescotland.com, theherald.com, discoverhubpages.com. Music was by Alfred Grufspra of The Creative Journey, PG Richmond of Creative Audio, Suki Tahashi, Extreme Freddy, and additional sounds were supplied by the Free Sound community, all of whom you will find over amongst the kind contributors on Pixby. As for you, the listener, I appreciate your company, and stay scared.